Today, Wednesday, 9th October, we still wait to see when the Israeli strike on Iran is going to take place. And of course, the war in Ukraine grinds on. Now, yesterday in my program, I discussed at very great length the reasons, the possible causes for the delay in the Israeli strike against Iran, a strike which, by the way, the Israelis have given us every reason to believe will take place, and which I have no doubt in some form or other will take place at some point over the next couple of days or weeks. Now, I ought to say that yesterday I received an email from one of the most helpful people who follow these programs, who made the point that this is the time of Yom Kippur and that Israel might have further reasons in light of this to delay the strike against Iran until after the holiday. Not, I think, so much because of the holiday itself preventing the Israelis from conducting a strike, but because they would not want counterstrikes to take place from Iran during the holiday. That, at least, is my understanding of this email. If I've misunderstood it, I apologize in advance. Well, I apologize in advance to the sender. I think that's maybe a very strong point. I still think that probably there's a lot more going on even than that. There is a very strange, very curious story, which I suspect is true, in the Times of Israel, that says that Prime Minister Netanyahu is refusing to allow his defense minister, Yoav Galant, to travel to the United States to meet with US officials until President Biden himself agrees to a telephone call between himself and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I am not clear at all why the one is connected to the other, why Netanyahu insists on a conversation with Galant, insists on a conversation with Biden before Galant himself can go to the United States. Is it that he doesn't trust Galant? Maybe. There's said to be tensions between them. In the past, there have been reports that Galant has resisted pressure from Netanyahu, as have other senior officials within the Israeli military, for an expansion of the war. And perhaps Netanyahu fears that if Galant goes to the United States without some kind of framework having been agreed with the Americans in advance, well, he might go to the United States and water down whatever proposals for strikes against Iran Netanyahu wants to make. But anyway, it's a report, it's in the Times of Israel, it's been reported in other places, almost certainly it's true. If you believe, as by the way I do, that there are tensions between the Biden administration or some members of the Biden administration and Netanyahu and his cabinet, well, this is a further evidence of that, and further evidence that there is a degree of dysfunction and disarray, both in Jerusalem and Washington, as to how to go forward. There is a further report that is also circulating, which is that, and this is from the Wall Street Journal now, that the Americans are being kept once again in the dark by the Israelis about what the Israelis intend to do. That the Americans believe that the Israelis do not intend to attack Iranian nuclear sites and energy installations, but that they don't know this for a fact, and that the discussions between the Israelis and the Americans are still ongoing, and presumably that all of this Israeli reticence is proving very frustrating to the Americans. Now, there is a very, very wide current of thought. It's expressed in many places, including by people whom I take extremely seriously, that all of this is smoke and mirrors, that the United States government is basically united in supporting Israel in whatever it does, not only united, but that it is, in fact, urging the Israelis on. There is even a line of thought which says that the United States is using Israel as a kind of proxy to cause as much chaos and violence and war in the Middle East as possible. Though exactly what the American objective is in doing that, why the United States would want, for example, a confrontation with Iran at this particular moment when the United States is already under stress with the war in Ukraine and has concerns, or at least stated concerns, about its conflict with China. Well, I myself am not sure, and I don't really see that. There is, of course, the further view that the Israeli authorities have such overwhelming influence in the United States that enables them to a great extent, or perhaps to a complete extent, to shape US policies, and that for that reason also all of this talk about dissension between the Americans and the Israelis is overstated, and that this explains why ultimately the Americans end up supporting whatever it is that the Israelis do. I'm going to state here my own view, and it's based on my own experience working with two governments, those of Greece and, by the way, of Britain, and through my own various dealings with various people who have worked in the United States government, and my own readings of American history going back, well, at least to the time of the Second World War and since, and my own understandings of how the American government works. I think that all of these views attribute a degree of coherence to American policy making that almost certainly does not exist. Certainly within the American political and military system, there is, if you like, a clear trend or default position which always pushes the United States towards more confrontational and aggressive positions than, in my opinion, or in the opinion of many, many people, it should be taking. There is, if you like, a structural bias within the US government which always trends in that direction. And that is one reason why it is so difficult in any situation like the one we're seeing currently in the Middle East for the US government, especially when it is weakly led, as it is at the moment, to impose discipline and restraint, not only upon its allies, but upon itself. But the idea that the various people who inhabit the American policy-making machine are capable of sitting down and thinking things out and inventing a whole smoke and mirrors narrative that there are dissensions between the Israelis and the Americans in order to confuse people, even as they secretly agree with the Israelis for whatever reason, some kind of aggressive policy in the Middle East. I personally find that difficult to believe. I don't myself think that this is true. I've observed closely the various people who make policy in the United States. I've looked at the various bureaucracies. I'm not just talking now about the politicians, but I've read reports in RAND. I've read all the usual reports in RAND. I've read all of those things. And frankly, I don't believe that these people, that the United States government collectively is capable of coming together and carrying out a plan like this. And if we bear in mind the fact that we are in the period of an election and that an election contest is underway in the United States, and I'm reading articles in the Financial Times which are telling us that the race is very tight and that it's difficult to ascertain what the outcome would be. Well, in a particular context like that, I would have thought that the administration would want, above all, to give an appearance of unity and strength in its foreign policy, rather than division and weakness, which can only play to the advantage in the election of its political opponents. And, well, given the biases that exist within the American governmental system, I would have thought that, if you like, the permanent government of the United States would also want to give an appearance of unity and strength as opposed to dissension and weakness. So that's my own view about this. I do believe all of these reports that, Biden and Netanyahu don't get on with each other, that Netanyahu runs rings round Biden, things that we read all the time in places like the Financial Times. There's actually an article in the Financial Times with that very title. I think that all of this in itself is likely to be true. But I also believe that within this very complex political system that exists in the United States, there not only is a faction in the there not only is a structural bias which always favours escalation, but I think that there is also a very, very powerful faction which will always lobby for escalation, especially in a conflict in the Middle East or against a party like Russia or China, and that faction is busy and active at the moment, as we saw with that article in Politico, which spoke about how White House aides are telling the Israelis to press forward with their war against Hezbollah, despite the attempts of the US government, the public attempts of the US government to broker a ceasefire, and that Israel can be comfortable disregarding all those efforts by the United States government to broker a ceasefire, because in the end, whatever Israel does, if it does take the step of escalating in Lebanon, the United States will ultimately end up supporting it. So there is this lobby. It is always there, the faction, people who I call the neocons, and who I suspect many of them probably would call themselves neocons themselves. They're always there. They, as I said, haven't created that structural bias towards escalation. I believe that's been there ever since the start of the Cold War, just saying. But this is an actual existing self-aware faction within the US government. It exists within the permanent bureaucracy. It consists amongst the various aides. And again, I doubt that they are setting about deliberately creating an appearance of dissension and in order to fool us as to what is going on. Rather, I think that they are doing what they have repeatedly done in the past, which is using their very highly developed skills in bureaucratic warfare to advance their approach to US foreign policy, that they take advantage of the structural bias that always exists towards escalation, and that they are partly responsible for all the dissension and all the uncertainty that exists, because they can be guaranteed at any time to work to undermine any attempt, however feeble and unsupported it might be, towards de-escalation and compromise, because these people will always, by definition, oppose it. As I have said, you see it there, these people have no reverse gear, and I think that we see that playing out in the Middle East now, just as we have seen it play out in so many other places, most recently in Ukraine. Anyway, there we are. That's my own view. As I say, I don't think there's any great master plan. I don't think the US government is capable of formulating a master plan. Some people will come up and provide ideas. They can publicize RAND reports and things of that kind. I don't think that the entire bureaucracy necessarily adopts these plans, or that they shape policy to any great extent. But as I said, there is always that structural bias towards escalation, and there is always going to be a lobby within the government that will argue for escalation, no matter what the situation and no matter what the conflict, but perhaps especially so in any conflict involving Israel and playing out in the Middle East. So there we are. Those are my thoughts. I'm going to just finish all of that with one further point, which is ultimately, given that the United States probably will in the end back any escalation that Israel undertakes, this whole debate has very limited importance. It hardly matters what the intentions and the perspectives of the US government ultimately are, if we all know, if it turns out that it is going to go for escalation anyway. If it's all the result of chaos and dysfunction, if it's all result of bureaucratic warfare, if it's all part of some great master plan, well, we're likely to end up at the same point anyway, and we can spend an awful lot of time debating it, but in the end, it really doesn't matter. When we are in the crisis, which we will be, then of course it will matter, because of course at that point, this thing hasn't been thought through, and there is no evidence that I could see that shows that it has really been properly thought through, not by anybody, that if it has not been thought through, then it is going to be extremely difficult to find a way out. But that is a question for the future. As to what happens over the next few weeks, well, I've said consistently since Prime Minister Netanyahu visited Washington that a war is coming, and a war, I suspect, one way or the other, is what we're going to get. Now, anyway, in the meantime, even as all of these debates and discussions take place in Washington and between the Israelis and the Americans, and even as the Israelis assess what they're going to do, fighting continues in Gaza, fighting continues in South Lebanon. It's very difficult to get a clear picture of what is going on in South Lebanon. Undoubtedly, the Israelis have occupied some territory. I don't get the sense that it is very extensive or that it seriously affects Hezbollah's position. Pictures have emerged of a particular village in South Lebanon, which looks like it has been completely obliterated. There's pictures of what the village looked like before and what it looks like now. And, well, a village has been turned into a ruin, or so it seems to me. And undoubtedly, I think that there's little doubt that this is the result of Israeli shelling and Israeli bombing. Can't imagine how else that could have happened, and the Daily Telegraph says as much. But the key question for me is not whether the Israelis are able to capture the odd village or whether they're devastating places. Well, of course, that is important because these are the homes of people which have been devastated. And of course, many people, no doubt, are dying. So it is important. But in terms of the conflict, what matters in the end is not whether the Israelis are able to make minor gains. It is whether Hezbollah is able to hold together. And I think the answer now, clearly and unequivocally, is that it is. It's held together, it's resisting, it's fighting the Israelis, it's able to continue to launch missile and rocket strikes into Israel. Whatever expectations there had been, or fears there had been, that Hezbollah might collapse, for the moment at least, they appear confounded. And frankly, I think that the longer the situation continues as it is, the longer we have this fighting in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah holding together, the less likely it becomes that Hezbollah will collapse. On the contrary, I'm guessing that by now we've gone past the point where it is likely to collapse. And from this moment on, the more likely it is that Hezbollah will gradually become stronger and its resistance will become stronger, and that the Israelis will find themselves in another war of attrition, which, as I've said previously, they can ill afford. And if that is true, then we come to the question of what exactly have the Israelis achieved over the last few weeks. They've carried out a whole series of operations against Hezbollah. We've had the exploding pages. We've had the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. But at the moment, and for the record, it seems it's increasingly starting to look as if these were all big, demonstrative events that have changed nothing substantively on the ground. And if that is true, if that is correct, then it ought to reinforce doubts both in Jerusalem and Washington about the direction of policy, about where all of this is going, about whether the trajectory is right, whether this constant escalation is leading anywhere, or whether, on the contrary, another debacle is on the horizon. That ought to be the debate that's taking place now. Perhaps it is the debate that's taking place now, but if so, I've seen absolutely no evidence of it. But that ought to be the debate that is taking place now. Not about whether this is a good moment to escalate or not, but whether the extraordinary escalation that has already taken place over the last few weeks has actually achieved anything at all, and whether it has improved Israel's, and indeed the US's position, or whether, on the contrary, things are much where they previously were, except that with the latest Iranian missile strike and with the moves that appear to be taking place between the Russians and the Iranians, whether, on the contrary, the overall geopolitical position of the Americans and of the Israelis is actually deteriorating. Anyway, I'm confident that that discussion is not taking place, but that is the discussion that should be taking place, because if prior escalation has failed, then it seems to me that further escalation looks like doubling down on failure rather than building on success. Anyway, there we are. We will see what happens. At some point, given all that we've heard and all that's been said, a further Israeli strike on Iran, or at least on some Iranian targets, looks overwhelmingly likely. For the moment, we will see how the debate shapes out, and we must also await this meeting between President Putin and President Pezeshkian of Iran, which is due to take place in 2 days' time in Ashgabat in Turkmenistan, and that will probably provide us with some further insight of what is happening and of what decisions are being made between those two countries. Anyway, there we go. Let's move on to that other big conflict, the one in Ukraine, because here I think we can now clearly see the direction of events, and well, they are now becoming, I think it's fair to say, increasingly disastrous. Now, let's start first of all with the critically important Pokrovsk, Kurakhovo, Selidovo, Ugledar direction, the area where this massive battle is now underway. Well, Ugledar has fallen. The Russians are now preparing to attack the various villages that are still in Ukrainian control, close to Ugledar itself. There are reports that they have entered Katerinovka and Antonovka, two of these villages, and that they're preparing to attack Bogoyavlenka and Novoukrainka. So these battles are already about apparently to happen. But perhaps even more dramatic is the news about what is happening further west. And well, a couple of days ago, 1 or 2 videos ago, I spoke about how the Russians on the east bank of the Dnieper in Zaporozhye region seem to be advancing along the banks of the Dnieper. They seem to have crossed a water obstacle, established positions there, that they seem to be preparing for an attack on the village of Pyatikhatki, and how we heard reports of Russian moves towards the town of Orekhov, all of which suggest that the ground is being prepared for some major Russian offensive in the Zaporozhye Kherson area, with Ugledar now in Russian hands. The way appears to be open for the Russians to conduct a major offensive, ultimately towards the city, the great city of Zaporozhye, one of the big cities in Ukraine, and the first steps to that effect appear to have been taken. Well, it was all a little speculative, but now our old friend Vladimir Rogov, chairman of the Civic Chamber Commission on Sovereignty, Patriotic Projects and Support for Veterans, that's his current title, by the way, and also formerly a senior official in the Russian-backed government in Zaporozhye region. Anyway, he's back and he's giving information about the situation in the Zaporozhye region to the Russian news agency TASS. To repeat again, TASS is Russia's official news agency. It is state-owned, and what it says can, to a very great degree, be considered authoritative from a Russian point of view. Anyway, Rogov has now described the situation in Zaporozhye region, and he said this: our troops have gained a foothold in all liberated territories in Kamenskoye, the Russian army has the initiative. Kamenskoye is this important village in the area where the Russians have achieved their advance on the east bank of the Dnieper. And then he goes on to say, the offensive actions are ongoing. More advantageous positions along the main line of defense have been gained. Most of the fighting is taking place along the water reservoir. That's the water reservoir that the Russians have crossed, and towards the Moscow-Simferopol highway. Furthermore, our troops are active from the north to the south in the area of the village of Yanchekrak. The enemy is being pushed out to the east and the north. And TASS tells us that previously he'd reported, that's Rogov had reported, that the Russian army had advanced in the Stepnogorsk area in Kamenskoye and had seized tactical positions along the Yanchekrak River. So all of these places that he's talking about are in this same area where the Russians have made their most recent advance, advancing along the east bank of the Dnieper, starting an operation. It appears to invest, to surround, and ultimately capture the village of Kamenskoye, and then presumably to advance northwards along the Dnieper, along the east bank of the Dnieper, all the way north, up 30 kilometers until they reach the city of Zaporozhye itself. And, well, all of that looks like it's been coordinated with a further Russian advance, ultimately towards Orekhov, or Orekhovo, as the Russians refer to it as. This is this important town, somewhat to the east of these places, immediately north of Rabotino. I believe it's around 6 kilometers from Rabotino, which of course the Russians now control. There are reports that the Ukrainians are urgently creating fortified lines around Orekhov or Orekhovo, and north of this area where the Russians have made a breakthrough along the east bank of the Dnieper. But of course, the Ukrainians are now very overextended, and they're, as we shall see in a moment, suffering defeats in all sorts of other places. And with the Russians having made further advances, having captured further villages along the main road from Ugledar to Velikaya Novosilka, which is apparently the only significant fortified position that the Ukrainians actually have in northern Zaporozhye region. At least that's what I read. I believe it was on one of the pro-Russian Telegram channels. It's likely that a Russian offensive on Velikaya Novosilka will take place. And of course, if it falls, then the Russians have another route to advance towards Zaporozhye city as well. And Orekhov to the west of Velikaya Novosilka could itself ultimately find itself surrounded. So it looks as if something is cooking in Zaporozhye and Kherson region. The General Teplinsky is making his first moves with his group of forces Dnipro. This is a force that numbers 130,000 men, we're told, the biggest group of forces that the Russians have deployed in the whole area of the special military operation until now. This force has been held back in readiness for something, and now perhaps we're starting to get a sense of what this something might be. Well, all of this is for the future, but in the meantime, we have catastrophic news further north in the Kurakhovo area. Now, I have discussed what is happening in the Kurakhovo area in several programs, but just to repeat again, the Russians seem to be rapidly gaining control or surrounding a significant group of Ukrainian troops. Nobody seems to know exactly how many, northwest of Kurakhovo, in a series of villages, Alexandropil, Kurakhovka, Vovchenka, the small town of Girnik or Gornyak, as the Russians call it, and the village of Izmailivka. And yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry said that another village called Zoryanye, or according to the Russian Defense Ministry, Zoryanye Pershe, has been captured by the Russians. This is one of these villages, this cluster of villages, which now are in the process of being surrounded. And this is disastrous. The Russians control some, perhaps all, of the village of Ostrivka, close to Kurakhovo itself, on the Kurakhovo water reserve. They control Gostry, a little to the east of this village of Ostrivska. They, of course, also control Krasnogorovka. It looks as if they have now occupied all of the fields west of Nevolskoye and north of Krasnogorovka that had previously been occupied by the Ukrainians and which some people believed constituted a cauldron. They've also captured the village of Sukurinye to the northwest. They're supposed to have occupied at least a part of the village of Novoselidivka to the south of Sukurinye, and the village of part of the village of Izmailivka, another one of these villages. We've seen film or photographs or pictures that show the Russian troops on the territory of the town of Girnik or Gornyak, and the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed that the Russians control or have captured the villages of Zelanye Pershe and Zelanye Drucha. We have definite pictures which show Russian troops in Zelanye Pershe, but it's, as I said, the Russian Defense Ministry says that they also control Zelanye Drucha, and that those two villages, of course, are located immediately to the north of Zoryanye. This village, which the Russian Defense Ministry say the Russians have now captured. So, however you look at it, this is now a cauldron. The Russians have surrounded a significant force of Ukrainian troops in these villages. I don't know how large this force is. We're probably talking about a couple of thousand men, 2 or 3, perhaps 4,000 men at most. But it does seem as if the Ukrainians are indeed surrounded in these villages. There is, in theory, a further line of retreat, but it will be along small country roads from Vovchenka to the north of the Kurakhovo reservoir. The Russians are to the north, apparently controlling at least part of Novoselidivka and certain fortified positions to the south. Russian drones are operating continuously in this area So if there's any attempt by the Ukrainians to retreat from these villages, well, those Ukrainian troops who were trying to undertake that retreat would come under continuous attack from the Russians, continuous attack with drones and artillery and mortars and all that kind of thing. And, well, one way or the other, another disaster awaits the Ukrainians, or so it seems, in this area of these villages. Now, some days ago, I discussed an article which has appeared in the New York Times, which spoke about how the Ukrainians have a strategy which is to conduct a fighting retreat from Donbass, maximize Russian losses, and build up their positions, build up their reserves further beyond the Dnieper, presumably, and in that way cause the Russians to lose momentum and turn the tables on the Russians in the war. The title of the article, just to repeat, is Ukraine's Donbass Strategy: Retreat slowly and maximize Russia's losses. The idea is to use a dope tactics, letting Russian forces pound away until they have exhausted themselves. It's far from clear if the Ukrainian strategy will succeed. That was the New York Times. And there were all kinds of Ukrainian commanders who appeared to support that claim that this was indeed the strategy, who were interviewed for this article. There's been an article which I've had the link to. It was provided to me by the historian Jeff Roberts. There's been an article in Strana, Ukrainian magazine, critical of the Ukrainian government, or at least of the Zelensky government, published, I believe, outside Ukraine. But it basically says the same thing, that the Ukrainian strategy now is to wear the Russians down, to conduct a fighting retreat, to inflict as heavy losses on the Russians as possible, even as Ukraine prepares for some counter-move once the Russians are exhausted. And this article in Strana claimed that this is the strategy that Ukraine successfully applied in the summer of 2022, that the Russians were worn down by Ukrainian resistance, first in Mariupol and then in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, that the Russians suffered severe losses, capturing these supposedly strategically unimportant places, and that the Ukrainians at this set the scene for the Ukrainians to conduct their successful counterattacks in Kharkiv and Kherson region in the autumn of 2022. And the article in Strana suggests that this is the same strategy that the Ukrainians are following now. Firstly, wear the Russians down by inflicting all these severe losses upon them, even as the Russians continue to advance, build up reserves, and then take advantage of the fact that the Russians have exhausted themselves, presumably by launching some kind of counterattack in some place along the battle lines. Now, I have to say that, to me, following this war closely, all of this looks completely disconnected from reality. It looks like an attempt to rationalize events on the ground, to discover in them some kind of Ukrainian strategy, which I am confident does not exist, to basically either spin events or to wish upon events a perspective which is favorable to Ukraine, but which the facts, briefly, do not support. And well, to start with, I don't think that was the Ukrainian strategy in 2022. I think that if we go back to the events of the summer of 2022, I think that the Russians did indeed suffer significant losses in capturing Mariupol, Severodonetsk, and Lysychansk. But these were very, very big places. Mariupol, population at its peak of about 450,000. The Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation with all the various important places around it, population somewhere in the region of 300,000. Both major urban and industrial centers in Donbass, very close to Russian positions. I think from a Russian point of view, these were not only strategically important places, but places which the Russians had to capture. And to be frank, I think they were far more important to the Russians in 2022 than Kharkiv and Kherson regions were. I think that one of the reasons the Russians were prepared to withdraw from Kharkiv and Kherson regions and focus instead on capturing Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Mariupol was because they rightly judged those last two places to be strategically far more important than Kharkiv and Kherson region were to themselves. So that's the first point I would make. Moreover, I'm going to say this, the Russians certainly did suffer significant casualties in capturing these important cities, but so did the Ukrainians in defending them. And I don't myself believe that if one counts the losses on each side accurately, which of course we're not in a position to do because neither side discloses those losses. But I personally do not believe that if one counts the losses accurately, one would find that the advantage was to the Ukrainians. So I don't actually believe that there was a strategy by the Ukrainians to wear down the Russians in the summer of 2022. I think, on the contrary, they did that which they always do, which is defend places like Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and Mariupol to the most bitter end, inflicting massive losses upon themselves, disproportionate losses upon themselves, as well to some extent on the Russians. And anyway, I don't think that the situation today, anyway, bears much resemblance to what happened in 2022, when the Russian army was far smaller than it is today, and the Ukrainian army was probably significantly bigger than it is today. And besides, I don't think that we are seeing much evidence that the Ukrainians are, in fact, engaged in any sort of fighting withdrawal on the battlefronts. If they were engaged in a fighting withdrawal on the battlefronts now, surely they would be seeking to conserve their forces as well as deplete the Russian ones. But we're not seeing that at all. We're seeing Ukrainian troops left to fight in Ugledar to the point where they're surrounded and where one of Ukraine's elite brigades, the 72nd Brigade, has been all but devastated. We see evidence. We see another cauldron appearing in this cluster of 4 villages in the Kurakhovo area. Surely, if the Ukrainians, as I said, were conducting a fighting withdrawal, they would have conserved those forces and would have withdrawn them rather than allow them to fall into a cauldron. And surely the Ukrainians would not be defending in other undefendable places like Selidovo and Toretsk as well. I think that people who have adopted this perspective of what is going on the battlefields are not aware of the actual realities on those battlefields, probably because they're not going through the painstaking and arduous and far from attractive task that I put myself through every day when I look at what is actually going on the battlefields in more detail, trying to get a granular sense of what is actually happening. So, I just wanted to say that because, as I said, I've seen this narrative of the fighting withdrawal being now promoted in various places. Even a Russian channel, I think it was Radovka, actually spoke of the Ukrainians doing something like that. But as I said, if you actually look at the situation closely, then I don't think that it bears any relation to what is actually taking place. Besides, I might add that people like Mariana Bezuglaya and others who one would assume are in a position to know, like General Krivonos, for example, commentators on the Ukrainian side, seem to be completely unaware that this strategy exists. They're bloggers like Tarigami as well. They all seem to see a disaster shaping on the battlefields. And of course, they're also making the completely valid point that the places that the Russians are capturing or coming close to capturing, places like Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, and others, that these are actually important places, not perhaps because they're huge places in themselves, but because of their locations, because they bring the Russians closer to the Dnieper. And these commentators on the Ukrainian side seem to understand better than some others do what an existential crisis for Ukraine it would be if the Russians did indeed reach and establish themselves in the central areas of the Dnieper in force. Anyway, let's move on. Further north, there's more information. Further north from Kurakhovo, there's more information about the Russians gradually tightening their grip around Selidovo and preparing the ground close to Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. But this is all details, which I'm not going to devote more time to. It looks as if the battle for Toretsk, further east, is now indeed coming to an end. We have had lots of film and pictures now from Toretsk, mostly provided by the Ukrainians, and they can confirm that the important suburb of Zabalka in southwestern Toretsk has collapsed, that the Russians are in complete control of it. My guess is that they now control not just around 70% of the Toretsk conurbation, which includes places like New York and other places like that, but that they now control roughly 70% of the town of Toretsk itself. It looks as if they are in control of the central areas of Toretsk. I would not be surprised if in the next couple of days we have pictures of the Russians raising their flag over the central administration building in Toretsk itself. And, well, we have multiple reports that the Russians are in the process now of capturing, they've now reached and have entered the coal mine and the slag heap in south western Toretsk, and fighting is going on there against Ukrainian troops who are now at serious risk of being cut off. And well, TASS has now provided us with some information about the state of the battle in Toretsk. Now, the Russians refer to Toretsk as Dzerzhinsk, the Soviet name for Toretsk. Dzerzhinsk refers to Felix Dzerzhinsky, the creator of the Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission for combating counter-revolution and sabotage that was created by Lenin's government in 1918, and which evolved into the various Soviet secret police agencies, which are the precursors of today's FSB. Just to explain who Dzerzhinsky was, he was always considered something of a hero in the Soviet Union, just saying. And the city we call Toretsk, the Ukrainians call Toretsk, the Soviets renamed after him, or named after him. But anyway, this is what the TASS report tells us about the situation in Toretsk. As I said, they refer to it as Dzerzhinsk. The Ukrainian armed forces in Dzerzhinsk, referred to as Toretsk in Ukraine, in the Donetsk People's Republic, have retreated to the western outskirts of the city, a source in the security agencies told TASS. The enemy in Dzerzhinsk is pulling back its forces to the western outskirts of the city, the source said. According to the security agencies, I would love to know which security agencies, there is currently a mop-up operation ongoing, targeting the remaining pockets of resistance in the center of Dzerzhinsk. That would presumably include the administrative building and places like that. It looks like the battle for Toretsk is ending. We're probably days, maybe weeks, military summary channel guesstimated 2 weeks away from the town's final fall. Toretsk was considered to be, along with Avdiivka, the most heavily fortified position that Ukraine maintained in the whole of Donbass. It was so heavily fortified that no one believed, at least no one outside the Russian General Staff believed, that the Russians would ever conduct a head-on attack on it. Well, they did in May. We're now in October. It's taken the Russians some months, but it looks as if Toretsk, this incredibly heavily defended position, is about to fall. We're talking about an urban conurbation, which if you add New York to Toretsk and other places, perhaps had an aggregate population of around 60,000 people. So just saying, it looks as if this battle for Toretsk is about to end. The Ukrainian collapse in Toretsk, which is what we're talking about, is, or so it seems to me, almost certain to lead to a further Ukrainian collapse of whatever resistance there continues to be further north and east in Chasiv Yar. And with Toretsk having fallen, the Russians will have a clear way forward to lay siege to the town of Konstantinovka, further north, another place with an aggregate population of around 70,000. But with the Russians able to cut the supply lines to Konstantinovka, when they capture Chasiv Yar, in control of the high ground, it looks all but impossible that Konstantinovka could be defended for very long either. So this is a major operational crisis for the Ukrainians. And, well, it gets worse for them because a couple of days ago, to everybody's surprise, again except the Russians themselves, we had the sudden announcement that the Russians had captured the village of Verkno-Kamyanska, immediately to the east of the small fortified town of Siversk, the town which in northern Donbass fulfilled the same role as a fortified position that Ugleda fulfilled for the Ukrainians in southern Donbass. Anyway, the Russians captured Vimka to the south of Siversk. They'd apparently captured, well, it's now been confirmed that they have captured Verkhokamyanska immediately to the west of Siversk. Doubts about the claim from the Russian Defense Ministry have now been put conclusively to rest. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided pictures which show Russian troops in Siversk itself raising their flags in the village. So there is absolutely no doubt that the Russians are indeed in control of Siversk, in control of Verkhokamyanska to the east, to the west, to the east, of Siversk. So there is no longer any doubt about this. But alongside that, we've now had further news for the Ukrainians, which is that the Russian Defense Ministry says that the Russians have captured a village called Grigorivka. This is located to the northeast of Siversk, and there are reports that the Russians are close to capturing a further village called Serebryanka, located directly north of Siversk. And, well, if the Russians capture Serebryanka as well, then again Siversk is in a semicircle. The Russians are located to the east of Siversk in Verkhokamyanska. They would be located to the north of Siversk in Serebryanka and Grigorivka, and they would also be located to the south of Siversk in Vimka, and they would be well positioned to cut the supply roads to Siversk, such as they are, from the west to the west. So, situation in Siversk is looking very bad. And another of our old friends, Andrei Marochko, formerly of the Lugansk People's Republic, but now apparently acting as an independent analyst, but obviously also still well connected to the Russian military. Anyway, he's confirmed as much. He's provided this information to the Russian news agency TASS yesterday. Russian troops have started to entrap Ukrainian forces stationed in Siversk in the Donetsk People's Republic, with roughly 3,000 enemy troops expected to be encircled, Andrei Marochko, a military analyst, reported. Marochko earlier told TASS that having broken the Ukrainian defense line near Kremenaya in the Lugansk People's Republic, the Russian army launched an operation aimed at liberating Serebryanka and Grigorovka near Siversk in the neighboring Donetsk People's Republic. And in fact, we now know that they have actually captured Grigorovka, and Serebryanka apparently is about to fall. And we now have a quote of what Marochko then went on to say to Komsomolskaya Pravda radio. Komsomolskaya Pravda is a Russian newspaper. I believe it's the single Russian newspaper with the biggest circulation. Just saying, it's the closest that Russia has to a tabloid. That is perhaps rather ungenerous to it. It's actually a fairly serious newspaper, though obviously one with the kind of biases and perspectives that one would expect. But anyway, this is what Marochko told Komsomolskaya Pravda. We have recently received information that we broke the line of defense and approached Serebryanka and Grigorovka, so it could be said that the fight for these settlements has already started. And as I said, the Russian Defense Ministry has said that Grigorovka has now been captured. To the southwest of Kremenaya, that's a town somewhat to the north of these places, close to Siversk, there are also ongoing hostilities. There's an area of forest south of Kremenaya, and it looks as if the Russians are in the process of capturing this forest. And then Marochko goes on to say, essentially there is a kill zone being created and a fairly large Ukrainian military group inside it. By my count, roughly 3,000 Ukrainian troops may well find themselves in a very unfortunate position. That's Marochko. Now, just to say, Kremenaya is an important place earlier in the war. During Ukraine's Kharkiv counter-offensive, the Ukrainians captured first Balakleya and Izium and Kupiansk, and then they captured Liman, and then they crossed the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, and there was a lot of predictions that they would advance further eastwards, and there were all sorts of claims that they would be able to cut Russian supply lines to Donbass, something I never myself believed. But anyway, they were stopped in their tracks by Russian defenses that had been created in this town, small town of Kremenaya and Svatovo just to the north. And for a short time, in the late autumn of 2022, as I remember well, Kremenaya and Svatovo were for many people considered to be the single most important places in the war. And there were even some reports that appeared in places like The Guardian that claimed that Svatovo in particular had been captured by the Ukrainians, though in fact it never was. So anyway, just saying, now the Russians are attacking, and from defending Kremenaya, they're able to use it to advance south and clear this forest and approach Siversk from this direction as well. So as I said, Siversk very close to being surrounded. And again, going back to what I was saying previously about this claim that the Ukrainians show no real sign of engaging in any kind of fighting retreat, that these claims bear little connection to reality. Surely, with Grigorovka having now been captured by the Russians, with other places also around Siversk being captured, with Siversk almost encircled, surely the logical thing would be for the Ukrainians immediately to withdraw those 3,000 men from Siversk, to hold them back, to conserve their forces, to ensure that the Ukrainians could fight more effectively with those troops another day, rather than risk having them encircled and losing all or most of them in a pointless battle for Siversk. To say clearly a fighting withdrawal by the Ukrainian army to the Dnieper is what the Ukrainians ought to be doing. I remember one of the most interesting and prescient members of the Duran community, who's got a military background, by the way, writing to me some months ago, telling me that that is what the Ukrainians ought to do in this situation of fighting withdrawal to the Dnieper, creating fortified lines there, building up reserves, and then negotiating some sort of peace with the Russians. That ought to be their plan. That, after all, is what Jim Webb also, in effect, was suggesting, that they should go to the defensive, forget about offensives, go on to the defensive, and he was recommending that they do that all the way back in the summer of last year. That is not, however, as far as I can see, what the Ukrainians are doing at all. Now, there are claims that the Ukrainians are nonetheless trying to create extra brigades in their rear. There's talk about them reducing the mobilization age to 18, which I suspect, by the way, will happen. There are claims that various congressmen in the United States are putting heavy pressure on the Ukrainians to do that. Something which, by the way, I find unconscionable. I simply do not understand it. That political representatives of one country should urge another country that is fighting a war to sacrifice its young men in that kind of way. I cannot understand how one could do such a thing. But anyway, more likely than not, the Ukrainians will reduce the mobilization age. They will expand their conscription. They will try to build up brigades. But it's clear to me that they're going to find it very, very difficult to train these brigades. Well, first of all, to find the men. Mobilization is proving very, very difficult and is fiercely resisted now across Ukrainian society. They're going to find it difficult to do that. They're going to find it difficult to train these men in time. And of course, there continues to be the problem of equipping these brigades. And there's an article here. Well, first of all, I should say Josep Borrell has already said that Ukraine could only continue fighting for perhaps 15 days if the West cut off supplies. He is, of course, exaggerating. But we come back now to this vexed question of the West providing supplies. And we've had an article about this from Paul Taylor in The Guardian. He says the West's support for Ukraine is fading and that will empower Putin for his next war. Note that last point. He then goes on to say the US and Europe are failing to provide decisive military aid. A Trump victory could soon reveal the depths of this mistake. And then he goes on to say that in the corridors of Brussels, there is a sinking feeling that the political will to help Ukraine prevail over Russian aggression is ebbing on both sides of the Atlantic. And then we have all kinds of bitter statements about how neither the United States nor the Europeans are able to provide or are willing to provide Ukraine with the weapons, the wherewithal that it needs in order to defeat the Russians, and that they're all facing financial problems, budgetary crises, that all sorts of pro-war, pro-peace parties, always referred to as far-right parties, are rising in Europe, that the German government is weak, that President Macron has lost authority, that the Americans are distracted by their own election and by events in the Middle East. And it's always, as always with these articles, reduced to a question of will, not resources or capability. He actually says that in his very first sentence. There is a sinking feeling that the political will to help Ukraine prevail over Russian aggression is ebbing. But of course, it is not a question of will. Willpower can only take you so far. Again, there's a huge amount of discussion about the supposed effectiveness of deep missile strikes against Russia. We've had lots of statements from Pentagon officials that missile strikes against Russia, which would come with enormous risks, are not going to achieve very much. We've had articles appearing in the American media that there are not that many missiles anyway to start with. And how could you use this limited stockpile of missiles to change the course of the war in any significant way? But of course, Paul Taylor, oblivious to all of that, he still wants more weapons, more missiles. He wants this idea, this very bad idea, to be green lighted so that it can go forward. The only admission that there is any kind of resource issue is contained in this paragraph. EU officials see a parallel between reluctance to provide game-changing assistance to Ukraine. We've had endless numbers of cases where weapons have been supplied to the Ukrainians, which we've been told are going to be game-changing. And HIMARS missiles, which are now down to 10% effectiveness, so we're told. M777 howitzers, they didn't change the situation dramatically. ATACMS missiles and Storm Shadow missiles, which failed to cut off Crimea, which was the original purpose that they were provided for, just saying. The tanks, we're told that the tanks were going to change the entire situation on the battlefields, the Western tanks. They didn't. They turned out to be, as many predicted, completely unsuitable for the conditions and the landscape. And apparently many Ukrainian soldiers now refuse or are unwilling to operate them, principally for that reason. But anyway, we are then going back to Paul Taylor. He says US officials see a parallel between reluctance to provide game-changing assistance to Ukraine and the stubborn resistance among major European powers against collective borrowing and joint weapons purchases to boost Ukraine's and their own defences. Many European countries have emptied their threadbare ammunition stocks to supply Kiev and are struggling to expand national arms industries or source supplies abroad. So the solution apparently is to do that which the Germans and others were promised would never happen. Float Eurobonds, because that's what we're talking about. Pool financial sovereignty in ways that the treaties appeared to exclude, but to do it in order to keep Ukraine supplied with more weapons and to build up arsenals. But even if that were done, that would only produce results several years down the road. Simply pooling sovereignties, floating Eurobonds, raising money in that kind of way is not in itself going to create factories or expand factory space or resolve issues with supply chains. It's not going to provide the necessary products that are needed to create more weapons of every kind. It's not going to provide the workforces. All of this takes time. It is a long haul. It is a logistic burden that is a logistic and industrial burden that would require 5 to 10 years to sort out. Perhaps if you committed everything you had to do it, you could start to see something happen in a year or two. But is that politically electorally viable at this time. So what Paul Taylor is talking about makes absolutely no sense if analysed objectively. And it really doesn't make any sense in terms of forward planning. As Alex Christoforou and I discussed in a recent programme, this entire narrative that it's not a question of resources but of will that has hobbled Ukraine's war effort is essentially an attempt by people who were advocates for unlimited support for Ukraine to transfer responsibility onto others because they failed to grasp the fact that the resources did not extend sufficiently far. But anyway, if we come back to the situation today, with all of these problems now, with even people like Paul Taylor admitting that support is ebbing, he says it's down to willpower. In fact, I would argue it's down to resources, to the threadbare stockpiles that he himself acknowledges. Well, if that is the case, even if Ukraine recruits another 600,000 men, as I've seen some people suggest, how is it going to train them? How is it going to equip them? How is it going to do so in time to hold back a Russian army that is probably double that size already and which is growing in strength all the time? So this narrative that we can slow the Russians down, build up our reserves, hold out somewhere, the Russians will run out of momentum, is completely fantastical. It distracts from the realities of the situation on the ground, like those other fantastic plans that I was talking about, the ones floated in the Financial Times about admitting Ukraine into NATO, presenting that as a fait accompli to the Russians, and in effect presenting them with an ultimatum that they cease their advances or that NATO will act. All of these fantastical schemes and fantastical arguments are distracting from the main issue, which is the importance of starting negotiations, reality-based negotiations on actual terms, and doing so now. I suspect that there are some people in the United States who understand this. We've just learned that President Biden has postponed his trip to Europe and that he's indicated that he's not going to attend the meeting. He wasn't going to attend the Ramstein meeting on the 12th of October, at which President Zelensky was going to present his victory plan. Subsequently, we got further reports that Secretary Blinken apparently was not going to attend that 12th of October Ramstein meeting either. In the absence of anybody senior from the United States, it looks as if that entire meeting has now been postponed to some indefinite date. We don't know when. Apparently, the explanation the Americans are giving is that President Biden's hands are full coping with the storms that are currently present in the United States. I accept that the issue of the storms is a serious one and one that has been brought up in the US elections, but I have to say that nonetheless it does seem to me still as if the decision to call off this meeting on the 12th of October is because President Biden and his officials, knowing of the opposition from the Pentagon, do not want to have to go over the whole topic of discussion of Zelensky's victory plan, his demands for more weapons, his demands for accelerated admission into NATO, and for deep missile strikes into Russia. They don't want to go over all of that all over again. So I think that is probably the true reason why the Americans basically have pulled out of the Ramstein meeting, causing that meeting to be postponed again to some indefinite date. Perhaps it will reconvene at some point over the next few weeks, but I personally would not be surprised if the administration quietly makes a decision that the entire meeting is to be postponed either until after the election or perhaps after the new president takes office in January next year. And the fact that this is a political decision to avoid discussing these issues rather than a discussion, rather than a decision forced upon the Americans by the ongoing storms, is suggested to me by something else, which is that Zelensky's proposal for another peace conference, a follow-up to the one that was held a few months ago in Switzerland, a peace conference at which the Russians this time were supposed to be invited. They were supposed to have been invited to the last one as well, by the way, the one in Switzerland, only it turned out that they weren't. The invitation was for them to come and not participate in the conference itself, but to be there in a room next door. And then when the conference ended and unanimously agreed to support Zelensky's peace plan, the plan for the unconditional withdrawal of the Russians from all the territories of Ukraine that they currently occupy, pre-2014 Ukraine. Well, then the leaders of the peace conference, presumably the Ukrainians and the Western powers, would meet with the Russians in this adjoining room and present them with this consensus of the peace conference. And that would at that point be some kind of an ultimatum. I suspect that something fairly similar was envisaged for this peace conference, which Zelensky was trying to organize in November. Anyway, a decision has now been made that this peace conference is also going to be postponed. No venue for it was ever agreed. It's uncertain who was going to turn up. And it looks to me that this announcement to postpone the peace conference is connected to the American decision to postpone the Ramstein meeting as well. It looks as if the Americans have decided to clear the decks, to put everything back perhaps to next year, rather than to be pushed into further diplomatic expeditions and moves, and to decide and to be put into a position where they have to make further commitments to Ukraine, where they'd be under pressure to make further commitments to Ukraine that they don't want to make. If I am right in thinking this, and I suspect I am, then even as Ukraine reels from one defeat to the other on the battlefields, we have seen the first, strongest, and clearest sign that the United States is now closing the book on the whole affair. Well, that's where I end my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.